This is the story of how Belgium's king turned a supposed humanitarian mission into one of the most profitable and brutal private enterprises in modern history, and how the gap between what Europe was told and what was actually happening in Central Africa became one of the first international human rights scandals of the 20th century. This video covers what King Leopold II claimed he was doing in the Congo, what he was actually doing, and how the difference between those two things eventually caught up with him. Keep that gap in mind as we go, because it's the whole story. King Leopold II took the Belgian throne in 1865, inheriting a country too small and too young to care much about colonies. No navy, no merchant marine, and a government with little appetite for overseas territory. That disinterest turned out to work in Leopold's favor, because it meant that when he decided to chase a colonial project of his own, he wasn't doing it as head of the Belgian state. He was doing it as a private individual, spending his own money and staking his own name on it. His attention landed on Central Africa after the explorer Henry Morton Stanley charted the Congo River between 1874 and 1877. By November of 1877, Leopold had formed something called the Committee for Studies of the Upper Congo, later renamed the International Association of the Congo. On paper, it read like a scientific and humanitarian body. In practice, it was the machine Leopold built to seize personal control of a huge stretch of Central Africa. Stanley, now working directly for Leopold, spent 1879 through 1882 establishing stations along the Upper Congo and negotiating with local rulers, and by 1884, that organization had signed treaties with 450 independent African entities. Those treaties became the legal foundation Leopold would later stand on to claim the territory as his own. That claim got formalized at the Berlin Conference, which ran from November of 1884 into February of 1885, where 14 European powers plus the United States sat down to carve up African territory without a single African leader in the room. Leopold made his pitch there, framing the whole project as a crusade to bring civilization and stamp out the slave trade in a part of the world Europe hadn't yet penetrated, and the other powers bought it. On February 5, 1885, the Congo Free State was born as his personal possession, and he gave it that name officially on May 29th. Sit with that for a second, because it's strange even by the standards of 19th century imperialism. Other European powers took African territory as colonies administered by their governments, at least nominally answerable to a parliament back home. Leopold skipped that step entirely. He personally owned a territory roughly 85 times the size of Belgium, about a third the size of the continental United States, and he called himself its proprietor. Historians have called it the only private colony the world has ever seen. So what did Leopold actually tell people he was doing? The official story was humanitarian through and through. He promised to suppress the East African slave trade, promote humanitarian policies, guarantee free trade, and skip import duties for 20 years. Even the name of the organization he'd used to acquire the Congo, the International Association of the Congo, was built to sound like charity work rather than conquest. None of this was accidental. Leopold ran a sustained public relations campaign to sell this story to European audiences, courting journalists, funding favorable coverage, and welcoming hundreds of foreign Protestant missionaries from Britain, the United States, and Sweden into the Congo, partly because their presence lent his rule outside legitimacy. For the first several years, the story mostly held, and the territory wasn't even profitable yet. Leopold had burned through nearly his entire personal fortune trying to build a state presence there, and the whole venture teetered near bankruptcy through the late 1880s. Then a bicycle tire changed everything. In 1888, John Boyd Dunlop patented the pneumatic rubber tire, and global demand for rubber exploded almost overnight, first for bicycles, then for the automobile industry taking shape behind it. The Congo Free State happened to sit on enormous reserves of wild rubber, harvested from a vine called Landolphia that couldn't be farmed, only hunted down in the forest. And this is exactly where the humanitarian story and the actual operation of the Congo Free State split apart completely. To grab this new wealth, Leopold nationalized every acre of land the state considered vacant and handed most of it out as concessions to private companies, keeping roughly 250,000 square kilometers for himself under the name Crown Domain. One of the biggest concession companies was the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company, known as ABIR. Founded in Antwerp in 1892, and the numbers behind it were staggering. Rubber sold in Europe for about 6 francs 20 centimes per kilo in 1894, climbing past 10 francs by 1898, while the concession companies were paying roughly 1 franc 35 centimes to actually acquire that kilo from the Congo. One contemporary observer noted that ABIR had made a net profit in a single fiscal year, representing more than 12 times its initial capital investment, a result he called without precedent in the history of industrial companies. The share price tells the same story from another angle. A share worth 500 francs in 1892 was worth 15,000 gold francs by 1903, and the dividend climbed from 1 franc to 1,200 francs over that same stretch. Export numbers back this up too. The Congo Free State shipped out less than 250 tons of rubber in 1892, and by 1897 that figure had blown past 1,500 tons. Domain revenue tells an even starker version of the same trend, jumping from roughly 150,000 francs in 1890 to more than 18 million francs by 1901. None of that wealth came from voluntary trade. It came from a system of forced extraction enforced by Leopold's own militia, the Force Publique. Villages were handed rubber quotas, and because the vines couldn't be cultivated, only foraged, communities had to push farther and farther into the forest to find enough, abandoning the farming that actually fed them in the process. When a village missed its quota, the response was brutal. Raids, burned homes, women and children taken hostage, and mutilation, specifically the severing of hands. Here's the thing about those hands, they weren't random cruelty. Force Publique officers had to account for every bullet they used, and severed hands served as physical proof that ammunition had been spent on people rather than wasted. Survivor testimony collected later described soldiers killing villagers and cutting off hands to be counted by their officers, with one account describing 200 hands counted at once. This system earned a name that spread across Europe on its own: red rubber. The sheer scale of personal wealth flowing to Leopold out of all this is worth pausing on, because it clarifies exactly what was driving the operation underneath the humanitarian language. Belgian historians have estimated Leopold's personal profit from the Congo, mostly from rubber, at somewhere between 500 million and 1.25 billion euros in today's terms, and one narrower estimate puts his direct take between 1896 and 1905 alone at 70 million Belgian francs. There's also a financing trick most people have never heard of. Leopold issued bonds tied to the territory worth more than 100 million francs. Roughly $500 million today. Some sold, some handed out to favored associates, some used to pay for public building projects back home. Much of that money went into monuments and public works in Brussels and Ostend, lavish enough that Leopold picked up the nickname the Builder King. So the humanitarian language from Berlin, the promises about suppressing slavery, bringing civilization, guaranteeing free trade, that was the version sold to European publics and diplomats. The actual operation was a forced labor extraction economy run for the personal financial benefit of one man, enforced through terror at the village level. That gap between story and reality didn't stay hidden forever, though it took years to break through. As early as 1890, the historian and journalist George Washington Williams traveled to the Congo Free State himself and wrote an open letter to Leopold describing what he'd witnessed. Missionaries in the field, including the African-American missionary William Shepherd, were documenting mutilation and killing tied directly to the rubber system, all of it in direct violation of the terms Leopold had agreed to at Berlin. The real turning point came from an unlikely source, a shipping clerk. E.D. Morel worked for a Liverpool firm involved in Congo trade, and around 1900 he noticed something that didn't add up. Ships kept arriving in Antwerp loaded with huge volumes of rubber and ivory from the Congo, and yet those same ships left for Africa nearly empty, carrying little more than guns and ammunition bound for the Force Publique. Genuine two-way trade doesn't look like that. What it suggested was that the Congo wasn't trading with Europe at all. It was being stripped. Morel's digging built enough pressure to reach the British government, and in 1903 the House of Commons passed a resolution on the Congo, instructing the British consul stationed in the territory, an Irish diplomat named Roger Casement, to investigate directly. Casement spent weeks traveling through the upper Congo basin, interviewing workers, overseers, and mercenaries, and collecting testimony straight from Congolese witnesses. His findings reached the British Parliament on February 12, 1904, in a document that became known as the Casement Report, 40 pages long with another 20 pages of individual witness statements describing killings, mutilations, kidnappings, and beatings carried out by Force Publique soldiers. One missionary quoted in the surrounding record described being so shaken by what he'd found in a single village that he told the local people he'd try to ensure they'd only be killed for actual crimes going forward, which says more about the ordinary level of violence than almost anything else in the record. The Congo Free State's administration fired back within a month with an official rebuttal, denying the scale of the allegations and painting the report as British commercial jealousy wearing a humanitarian mask. Casement and Morel answered by formally founding the Congo Reform Association in March of 1904, an organization that eventually built branches as far away as the United States and kept steady public pressure on Brussels. Facing that pressure, Leopold tried a defensive move of his own, convening a commission of inquiry made up of a Belgian, an Italian, and a Swiss investigator, betting that an independent-looking body would take the heat off him. The commission worked between October of 1904 and February of 1905, and when its findings finally came out in November of 1905, they backfired badly. Instead of clearing Leopold, the commission largely confirmed what Casement had already reported, including systemic forced labor and mutilation carried out by concession companies like ABIR. Even with his own commission confirming the abuses, Leopold clung to personal control of the Congo for several more years. The Belgian parliament voted in principle to take the territory over in 1906, and by September of 1908, it had passed a formal annexation treaty and colonial charter. On November 15, 1908, in a ceremony held in the capital, Boma, the Congo Free State, officially became the Belgian Congo, a state colony now run by the Belgian government instead of owned outright by one man. Leopold didn't walk away with nothing, though. As part of the handover, he squeezed a settlement out of Belgium, 110 million francs to cover his personal debts, 45 million francs to finish building projects he'd already started, and 50 million francs in future revenue from the very colony he was surrendering. Before the transfer, he also destroyed a substantial number of Congo state administrative records, which has made the job of reconstructing exactly what happened that much harder for historians ever since. Leopold died a little over a year later, on December 17, 1909, and when his funeral procession moved through the streets, crowds booed, a public verdict the official narrative had never quite managed to erase. Even now, historians can't agree on exactly how many people died. The number most often repeated in popular accounts is around 10 million, a figure that traces back largely to historian Adam Hochschild's 1998 book. But that estimate is genuinely contested inside the historical field itself. Other researchers argue the population decline was smaller, pointing to a drop of somewhere between 20 and 25% over a longer stretch of time, driven significantly by disease like smallpox and sleeping sickness rather than violence alone. A Belgian government commission at the time concluded the population had been reduced by half, while admitting in the same breath that no accurate records existed to actually confirm it. Some historians have gone as far as calling the original population estimates wild guesses. What isn't in dispute is the system itself, a forced labor extraction economy enforced through mutilation and hostage-taking, run for one man's personal profit, and dressed up publicly as a civilizing mission. The death toll is argued over. The mechanics that produced those deaths are not. You can still see the legacy today. Kinshasa, the modern capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, carried the name Leopoldville until 1966, and Leopold's memory remains genuinely contested even now. In 2005, a statue of him was briefly put back up near Kinshasa's central station, only to be torn down again within hours once the public backlash hit. The Congo Free State ran for 23 years on a story Europe wanted to believe, told by a king who had every reason in the world to keep telling it. If you want to see how this same pattern of official story versus documented reality played out somewhere else entirely, check out the next video on screen now.